Well, hi, everybody. Today is April 6, 2021. Today is an asynchronous day. Seventh grade students are taking their writing star. So you will be doing all your work asynchronously today, whether you are on campus or whether you are virtual today. So this video will have some instructions for the day and also explain the topics to get you ready for your assignment in Schoology. Okay? So please watch the video so you'll be ready for your assignment. So the big topic for today is the causes of the Civil War. And most people will say that the cause of the Civil War was slavery, but it's bigger than that. There were many causes to the war that almost split up our country completely. And so those three causes of the Civil War are sectionalism, the expansion of slavery, and states' rights. And many people will actually point to states' rights as the biggest reason for the Civil War in the 1860s in the United States. So let's take a look at each of these causes of the Civil War. First, let's look at sectionalism. Okay, the important part to point out here is that the word sectionalism has the word section in it. And when things are in sections, they're in their own area. So if you look at the United States in the 1860s, you'll notice that there are three areas of the country, right? And we have areas of the country today. However, it's a little different. Okay, there are states within each region that are a little different. But back in the 1860s, we had three distinct regions that lived completely different. And so if you look here at the definition of sectionalism, it says that it's a loyalty to one's own region or section of the country rather than the country as a whole. So that means if you were a Southerner, you were more in line to support Southern ideas than the ideas of the United States. And so with that, it's hard to have a United States when there's that kind of thinking in the country. So let's take a look at some of the differences. So in the North, the people. Okay, let's look at some of the people factors. It was mostly cities, more urban, many factory workers, some free Black families. The geography was a cool climate, rocky soil with ports. The economy was manufacturing, okay, factory work, fishing, and wage labor. Okay, wage labor are workers that are working on an hourly amount. When we take a look at the South, there is a completely different way of life. And mostly it's economic, which then affects the social part of it. So the people were different. Wealthy plantation owners depended on slave labor. Okay. There were also poor white farmers. We sometimes get the wrong idea that every person was a plantation owner in the South, and that is not true. It was a very small percentage that owned most of the wealth in the South and most of the slaves. So clear out of that. The geography was a warm climate, which is conducive to farming, fertile soil, and the economy was farming. Okay, cotton is king. The South was the largest producer of cotton in the world at the time, and then slave labor. So we talked about sectionalism. Let's talk about one of the biggest issues of the time, the expansion of slavery. And so slavery was one of the big dividing issues of our country during the 1860s. And the North and the South had different views of it. And it had to do with politics, but it also had to do with economics. So in the North was really controlled by the Republican Party. So you had two sections of the country that were ruled by two different political parties. So the Republican Party of the time period looked to limit or completely abolish slavery. Okay. And so those abolitionists were the people that wanted to reform to just end slavery completely. There was also this debate about westward expansion. Okay. As the country grew and we added more states, what would we do with the expansion of slavery? So there were two groups. One group wanted to stop it completely. The other group was interested more in preventing it from invading new areas of the country as we expanded our country. Now, the South was different. It had the Democratic Party, which was the Andrew Jackson Democratic Party. And so it dominated the South. It supported slavery. Okay. And it also had some presence in the North. So it made things politically difficult for Republicans in the North. Westward expansion, they supported the idea of expanding slavery into the Western territories, which would allow it to grow across the United States. And the economy relied on the demand of cotton from plantations and textile mills. Okay, remember, textile mills were closely tied to the cotton plantations because that's what the cotton would turn into, cloth. Now, the big issue of today is states' rights, and we're going to take a closer look at it today, and to understand that yes, the country was split into sections. Yes, the expansion of slavery was a debated issue, but the Civil War essentially comes down to the idea of states' rights, and it's two ways of thinking. Does power lie with the federal government, or does power lie with the individual states? And so in the North, they believed that the federal government was more important, okay? That keeping the country as a whole together and aligned was more important than giving each of the individual states the authority to decide issues like slavery, okay? And they felt that all states should follow US laws. All right? So they felt that you couldn't have a country that was divided politically and divided on issues and keep a country running. And the South had the opposite point of the view. They thought that according to the 10th Amendment here, that states have the power to nullify or ignore federal laws that are unconstitutional. And so this came up during the Andrew Jackson time period, during the nullification crisis, when South Carolina threatened to just do its own thing or leave if it needed to. So before we talk about states' rights a little bit more and the events that were right up to the start of the Civil War, let's take a look at a big list of events that led to the Civil War. All right, and some of them, they're 40 years before the time period. So we have the Missouri Compromise of 1820. All right, essentially creating a line across the country that said North is free, South is slave. That was all fine and it worked for our country until California was ready to join in 1850. And that created the Compromise of 1850. And California comes in as a free state, which is good for northern states. But the big part of that was that some of these countries, you'll see here in purple, get to decide for themselves with popular sovereignty. And the fugitive slave law comes into play, where escaped slaves had to be returned back to the South, which allows slavery to continue to strengthen. The book Uncle Tom's Cabin also divides the country as it showed the realities of slavery. The Kansas-Nebraska Act led to a miniature civil war. So here in this picture, you'll see me outlining here, Kansas and Nebraska were allowed to decide for themselves with popular sovereignty if they were going to be slave or free, even though they were above the 3630 line. And it led to a lot of violence, an event called Bleeding Kansas, between the two groups, pro-slave and anti-slave. The Dred Scott case was also a dividing issue. And so he was a former slave that sued to be free. The Supreme Court ruled that although he was living in a free state, he was always considered property. And so it created this constitutional issue of slavery, that slaves were not people, they were instead property. And then the last big event that leads to the Civil War is the election of Abraham Lincoln. And we'll take a look at that in a second, because it showed the true division in our country at the time period. So let's take a look at the election of 1860, which is considered the tipping point in the United States Civil War. So if you look at the map, the election map of 1860, one, you'll notice the country is much smaller, but two, you will also notice the color differences, right? There are 4 candidates, where in today's elections, we essentially have 2 candidates, 2 major parties. But here's the key part. The Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln won the northern states. The Democrats divided up the South between 3 candidates. And when that happens, every Southern state, when they realize that Abraham Lincoln is going to win the election, they see no path where their states' rights are going to be protected. They see no path where slavery can expand in our country, because that was the the stance of the Republican Party at the time. And so what they decide to do is they decide to leave. They decide to uh, secede from the United States. So soon after the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, 11 states seceded or broke away from the Union during the months after the election. So the big question for today is, who should have more power to make decisions, the federal or the state government? If you were a Southern state at the time, you thought states should decide. Let me grab the pen here. And when you say that the states should decide, you say that the states should be able to decide on issues like slavery. Meaning, if an individual state wants to do its own thing, like South Carolina, they should be allowed to do it, even if the other states don't want to do it. Whereas one side thinks that the federal government should be in charge, meaning the United States as a whole, it will make a law, every state falls in line and doesn't have the right to just nullify or ignore a law or a policy. So to give you a visual of what states' rights the debate is about, look at this image. When you think about laws, you have to decide, do you prefer that the laws and the power lies here, meaning the United States as a whole? So Congress, the president, the Supreme Court are making decisions and every state falls in line? Or do you believe that every state can do its own thing, meaning that state could decide to have slavery, this state could decide to have slavery, this state could decide to be free, this state could decide to let people vote? So that's the big question to ponder. So the disagreement about states' rights is, if a state disagrees with a national federal law, do they have the power to nullify or refuse to follow it? That's the big question. Remember, nullify means to say no to it. And so the Constitution says that under the 10th Amendment, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the United States, are reserved to the states. So during the 1860s, many states, particularly Southern states, felt that this was their best argument, that if the United States did not have an official policy on slavery, that it was allowed to decide for themselves, and every state should be allowed to do so. And so if a state disagrees with a national or federal law, do they have the power to nullify, refuse to follow it? We've talked about this before, but the federal government thought that the union as a whole was more important. Preserving the United States was more important than the individual states. All states must follow the laws. However, if you were a Southern state, you thought that you did have the power to nullify and ignore a law and apply your own policy. And if the country were to abuse its power, or you felt that it overstretched its power, you could secede and leave the government. And so that is the big question for today, states' rights. Now, before you go work on your Schoology assignment, just remember the Civil War was much more complicated than just the division about slavery. It was about sectionalism, it was about the expansion of slavery, and it was about states' rights. Now you are ready to complete today's Schoology assignment.